8-year-old girl begged hospital, "Please don't let my mama die." Then a stranger appeared. Sofia Martinez was 8 years old, but she'd already learned that sometimes grown-ups lie. They promise things they can't deliver. They walk away when you need them most. So when the hospital security guard started walking toward her family that freezing February night, she knew what was coming. Another door slamming shut. Another, "Sorry, we can't help you." Her mama was dying in a stranger's arms. Her baby brother hadn't made a sound in hours, and the most important medical center in Cedar Falls was about to turn them away because they didn't have the right pieces of plastic in their wallets. Sofia had practiced being invisible for months. It kept them safe. But now, with everything falling apart, she found her voice. "Please don't let my mama die." 4 words that would split one night into before and after. 4 words that would prove sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right person is listening. The February wind cut through Cedar Falls like a blade, carrying with it the promise of snow that hadn't yet fallen. At 11:47 p.m., the streets lay empty except for the occasional sweep of headlights that painted brief, ghostly shadows across the pavement before disappearing into the night. The Memorial Health Center stood like a fortress of glass and steel, its windows glowing with sterile fluorescent light that seemed to mock the darkness beyond. On the concrete steps leading to the hospital's main entrance, 3 figures huddled together against the cold. Sofia Martinez, 8 years old, but carrying the weight of someone much older, sat with her thin arms wrapped around her 2-month-old brother, Ethan. Her dark hair, once carefully braided by her mother's loving hands, now hung in tangled strands around her face, damp with the mist that clung to everything in the frigid air. Her jacket, a threadbare pink puffer coat, 2 sizes too small, offered little protection against the bitter cold, but she had tucked it around Ethan as best she could, leaving her own small frame exposed to the elements. Beside her, slumped against the unforgiving concrete wall, was Maria Martinez. At 31, she should have been in the prime of her life, but poverty and illness had carved deep lines around her eyes and hollowed her cheeks. Her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps, each exhale creating small puffs of vapor that disappeared almost instantly in the frozen air. A fever had been burning through her body for 3 days now, and what had started as a persistent cough had developed into something far more dangerous. Her lips, once full and quick to smile, were now pale and cracked, and her hands trembled not just from the cold, but from the illness that was slowly consuming her strength. Sofia looked down at Ethan, whose tiny face seemed even pale, so quiet, so fragile, that she had to press her ear close to his chest every few minutes, just to make sure he was still alive. The baby had stopped crying hours ago, which frightened her more than when he had been fussing. She had learned in her short but difficult life that silence was often more dangerous than noise. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind, "we need to go inside. Please." Maria's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on her daughter's face. "They'll ask for papers, Mia," she managed, her voice hoarse and broken. "Insurance cards. Things we don't have." The shame in her voice was almost as palpable as the cold. "They'll call the police, or worse, they'll take you and Ethan away from me." Sofia felt tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. She had overheard enough conversations between adults, seen enough of the world's cruelty to understand what her mother meant. They were invisible people in a system that only saw them as problems to be managed or removed. 3 months ago, they had been a family with a small apartment and dreams for the future. Now they were statistics, homeless, uninsured, desperate. Abuela Rosa always said that God watches over little sparrows, Sophia whispered, remembering her grandmother's weathered hands as they taught her to pray. She said that if He cares for them, He cares for us too. She closed her eyes and moved her lips in silent prayer, the same words her grandmother had taught her years ago, before cancer had taken her away and left the family truly alone. The wind picked up, sending empty plastic bottles skittering across the parking lot with a hollow, rattling sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in Sophia's stomach. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, a stale piece of bread from the shelter's breakfast, but her hunger seemed less important than the fear that was growing in her chest like ice. What if her mother didn't wake up next time? What if baby Ethan stopped breathing altogether? What if the morning found them frozen on these steps, another tragedy that would warrant a small paragraph in the local newspaper before being forgotten? In the distance, footsteps echoed against the pavement, steady and purposeful. Sophia looked up, squinting through the mist, and saw two shadows approaching through the yellow glow of the streetlights. Her first instinct was to make herself smaller, to become invisible, because in her experience, strangers meant danger, questions, and problems she was too young to solve. But there was something different about these footsteps. They weren't hurried or angry. They were measured, careful, almost respectful of the silence that surrounded them. As the figures drew closer, Martinez family, to these cold hospital steps, was paved with a series of small disasters that had accumulated like stones in an avalanche. 6 months ago, Maria had been working double shifts at the Riverside Diner, her hands raw from dish soap and her feet aching from standing on worn linoleum for 12 hours at a time. The pay was barely enough to cover rent on their tiny one-bedroom apartment, but it was honest work, and it came with the dignity of providing for her children. Then the cough started. At first, it seemed like nothing, just the lingering effects of a cold that Sophia had brought home from school. But as weeks passed, the cough deepened, became more persistent, and began to interfere with Maria's work. She started missing shifts, arriving late when the coughing fits kept her awake all night. Her supervisor, a middle-aged man with no patience for employees who couldn't maintain perfect attendance, issued warnings that escalated quickly to termination. Without steady income, the small family fell behind on rent. Maria tried to find other work, but potential employers saw a woman with a persistent cough, a baby in her arms, and an 8-year-old daughter who would need care after school. The math didn't work in her favor. Doors closed politely but firmly, and the savings account that had taken years to build, their emergency fund, their security blanket, dwindled to nothing within weeks. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday morning in December, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who avoided making eye contact as he explained their legal obligations. Maria had folded the papers with hands that shook, not from cold, but from the realization that she had failed at the most basic requirement of motherhood, keeping her children safe and sheltered. The homeless shelter had rules. Families could stay for 30 days, no longer. After that, they were expected to have found alternative arrangements. But alternative arrangements required money, credit checks, and references, luxuries that the Martinez family could no longer afford. When their 30 days expired, they found themselves moving from place to place, sleeping in Maria's beaten-down Honda Civic when they could find a safe parking lot, staying in cheap motels when Maria could scrape together enough for a single night, or sometimes, when desperation overcame pride, sleeping in the waiting rooms of 24-hour businesses until security guards asked them to move along. Sophia had watched her mother's transformation during these months. The woman who had once sung while making breakfast, who had helped with homework at the kitchen table, who had read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, gradually became someone else. Someone haunted. Someone always looking fundamental in Maria's spirit. They had waited for 4 hours in a room full of other desperate families, Sophia entertaining baby Ethan with whispered songs and games played with her fingers. When their names were finally called, Maria had explained her symptoms: the persistent cough, the fever that came and went, the exhaustion that made it hard to think clearly. The volunteer doctor, overwhelmed and understaffed, had listened with half his attention while reviewing other patients' files. "Sounds like a virus," he had said without looking up from his clipboard. "Rest, fluids, over-the-counter cough medicine. Next." Maria had tried to explain that the symptoms were getting worse, that she was having trouble breathing at night, that she was scared it might be something more serious. But the clinic was closing, there were other patients waiting, and the doctor's patience had worn thin. "Ma'am, we've done what we can," he had said, already moving toward the door. "If it gets worse, go to the emergency room." But going to the emergency room meant insurance questions, billing departments, and collection agencies. It meant exposing their family to a system that might separate them if the authorities decided that Maria was too sick to care for her children properly. So instead, she had bought generic cough syrup with their last $10 and hoped that time would heal what medicine could not. Now, sitting on these hospital steps with her daughter and infant son, Maria understood that hope had its limits. The cough had become a constant companion, and the fever made it difficult to think clearly about their next move. Sophia, with her 8-year-old wisdom that no child should possess, had been the one to suggest coming to the hospital. "We don't have to go inside, Mama," she had reasoned with logic that broke Maria's heart. "We can just sit outside where it's warm from the lights. Maybe someone will help us." The sound of approaching footsteps brought Maria back to the present moment. Through her fever-clouded vision, she could see 2 shapes moving toward them through the mist. Her first instinct was to gather her children closer to prepare for another confrontation with authority figures who would see them as problems to be solved or moved along. But Sophia was looking up with an expression that Maria hadn't seen in months: curiosity, mixed with cautious hope. "Mama," Sophia whispered, "I think someone's coming to help us." Marcus Rodriguez had been walking the same route every night for 3 months, ever since he and Atlas had settled into the rhythm of civilian life in Cedar Falls. The routine was partly therapeutic. Dr. Henderson at the VA hospital had recommended regular exercise as part of his adjustment therapy, but mostly it was practical. After 4 tours in Afghanistan, Marcus found that sleep came easier when his body was genuinely tired. Memories that belonged to another time and place. Atlas, his German shepherd companion, had adapted to these nightly walks with the same disciplined patience he had shown during their years of military service. At 6 years old, Atlas retained the alertness and intelligence that had made him invaluable in detecting improvised explosive devices. But civilian life had allowed him to relax in ways that hadn't been possible during their deployment. His dark coat, marked with the distinctive tan and black coloring that made German shepherds so recognizable, gleamed under the streetlights as he maintained his position slightly ahead and to the right of Marcus, a formation that had become second nature to both of them. Tonight felt different, though Marcus couldn't initially identify why. The air carried the same February chill. The streets were as empty as usual, and their route had remained unchanged. But Atlas, whose behavioral patterns Marcus could read as clearly as a favorite book, was showing signs of heightened awareness. His ears were more erect than usual, his gait slightly stiffer, and every few steps he would pause to test the air with his nose, a behavior that Marcus had learned to interpret as Atlas detecting something important, but not necessarily threatening. "What is it, boy?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice carrying the slight accent that revealed his Mexican-American heritage. His hand instinctively moved to Atlas's head, fingers finding the familiar comfort of soft fur and solid bone. The gesture was automatic, a physical connection that had helped both man and dog navigate countless dangerous situations overseas. Atlas responded by changing direction, pulling gently but insistently toward the medical center. This was unusual behavior. Their normal route took them past the hospital, but not directly toward it. Marcus felt his senses sharpening, the familiar alertness that had kept him alive during his military service. In Afghanistan, Atlas's intuition had been infallible. When the dog indicated danger, Marcus listened without question. When Atlas suggested a different path, Marcus followed without hesitation. As they approached the hospital's main entrance, Atlas's body language shifted dramatically. His tail, normally carried at a relaxed angle, dropped low, not in fear but in what Marcus recognized as his working posture. His steps became more deliberate, more careful, and he began emitting a low whine that was barely audible but full of urgency. Then Marcus saw them, 3 figures huddled against the hospital's entrance, so still and small that they seemed like shadows cast by the building's architecture. But as his eyes adjusted to the interplay of harsh fluorescent light and deep shadow, the scene resolved into heartbreaking clarity. A woman slumped against the wall, clearly ill. A young girl holding what appeared to be an infant, all of them inadequately dressed for the bitter cold. Marcus's training kicked in before his emotions could catch up. He quickly assessed the situation. No immediate physical danger, but clearly a medical emergency. The woman's posture suggested serious illness, possibly unconsciousness. The child appeared alert, what was likely hypothermic. The infant's condition was impossible to determine from this distance, but exposure to these temperatures could be fatal for someone so young. Atlas had stopped walking and was now sitting at attention, his eyes fixed on the small family. His behavior indicated what Marcus was already beginning to understand. These people needed help, and help needed to come immediately. Marcus approached slowly, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. Years of military service had taught him that desperate people could be dangerous people. But everything about this scene suggested vulnerability rather than threat. As he drew closer, he could hear the soft sound of the child's voice. She was talking to the woman, trying to keep her conscious, trying to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that had clearly spiraled beyond her ability to manage. "You folks okay out here?" Marcus asked gently, stopping several feet away to avoid seeming intimidating. His voice carried the natural authority of someone accustomed to command, but he kept his tone soft, recognizing that these people had probably experienced enough harsh treatment from authority figures. The little girl looked up, and Marcus felt his heart clench. Her eyes held the kind of exhausted wariness that belonged on the faces of soldiers, not children. She was beautiful, dark hair, intelligent eyes, fine features, but she was also clearly malnourished and terrified. In her arms, wrapped in blankets that were too thin for this weather, was a baby, whose stillness was more alarming than crying would have been. "We're okay," the girl said automatically, the lie coming so naturally that Marcus knew she had been using it for a long time. "We're just We're waiting." Atlas, without being commanded, had begun moving toward the family. His approach was careful, respectful, the way he had been trained to approach civilians in hostile territory. Marcus watched as his dog seemed to assess each member of the family individually, his nose testing the air around them, his eyes taking in details that would inform his next actions. When Atlas reached the little girl, he did something that surprised even Marcus. The dog sat down beside her, pressed his warm body against her side, and placed his head gently on her lap. It was a gesture of pure comfort, the kind of intuitive compassion that could— "Name is Atlas," Marcus said softly, crouching down to the girl's eye level. "He's got good instincts about people, and right now, he's telling me that you need help." Marcus looked at the woman, the mother he assumed, and saw that she was barely conscious. Her breathing was labored, her skin had an unhealthy flush that suggested high fever, and her body seemed to be shutting down, despite her obvious efforts to stay alert for her children. "My name is Marcus," he continued, addressing the little girl, who seemed to be the one making decisions for the family. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophia," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "This is my mama, Maria, and my baby brother, Ethan." Marcus nodded, processing the information while his mind began formulating a plan. These people needed immediate medical attention, but they were sitting outside the hospital rather than inside, which suggested barriers, probably financial or legal, that were preventing them from seeking help. "Sophia," Marcus said, his voice carrying the gentle authority he had learned to use with frightened civilians overseas. "I need you to listen to me carefully. Your mama is very sick, and your brother needs to get warm right now. We're going to go inside this hospital, and I'm going to make sure you get the help you need. Do you understand?" Sophia looked at him with eyes that were far too knowing for her age. "We don't have insurance," she said matter-of-factly. "They'll turn us away." Marcus felt anger flare in his chest, not at this child, but at a system that could leave a family in such desperate circumstances. But anger was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. These people needed action, not emotion. "They're not going to turn you away," Marcus said firmly. "I promise you that." He stood up and looked down at Atlas, who was still providing warmth and comfort to Sophia. "Atlas, stay." Then Marcus knelt beside Maria, whose eyes were closed, but whose breathing indicated she was still conscious. Very gently, he slipped one arm behind her back and another under her knees, lifting her with the same care he would use to handle an injured soldier. She was frighteningly light, her body feeling fragile in his arms, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. "Sophia," Marcus said, "I need you to walk with me. Atlas will stay right beside you, and I'll carry your mama. We're going to get everyone warm and safe, I promise." As they moved toward the hospital's entrance, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a veteran trying to adjust to civilian life. He was now the protector of a family in crisis. People deserved care regardless of their ability to pay. Behind them, the February wind continued to howl, but ahead lay the possibility of warmth, healing, and hope. Atlas padded alongside Sophia, his presence a steady reminder that sometimes help comes in unexpected forms, and that the bonds between human and animal can be as strong as those between family members. As the doors closed behind them, Marcus realized that this moment would mark a turning point, not just for the Martinez family, but for himself and Atlas as well. They had found their new mission, their new purpose in civilian life. They were no longer just veterans learning to navigate peacetime. They were guardians, protectors of those who needed someone to stand between them and a world that had forgotten how to show mercy. The memory came to Marcus with the sharp clarity that trauma often provides, triggered by the weight of Maria in his arms and the familiar sensation of carrying someone whose life depended on his strength. It was September 2018, outside Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan, and the morning sun was painting the mountains in shades of gold that made the landscape beautiful enough to forget, temporarily, how dangerous it was. Marcus had been a staff sergeant then, 29 years old, and responsible for a squad of soldiers who trusted him to bring them home alive. Atlas, just 3 years old, but already a veteran of dozens of missions, was at the peak of his abilities as an explosive detection dog. Their partnership had been forged over 18 months of daily training, shared dangers, and the kind of mutual dependence that created bonds stronger than blood. The mission that morning had seemed routine, a patrol through a village where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters were storing weapons. Atlas had been ranging ahead of the squad, his nose working methodically as he searched for the chemical signatures that indicated improvised explosive devices. His body language had been relaxed, professional, showing none of the tension that usually preceded his discoveries of hidden dangers. That's what made the explosion so shocking. The IED had been buried deeper than usual, wrapped in materials designed to mask its scent from detection dogs. When Atlas stepped directly over it, triggering the pressure plate that had been waiting for weeks for the right amount of weight, the blast threw both dog and handler 15 feet through the air and into a world of ringing ears, dust and blood. Marcus's first coherent thought, after the initial disorientation faded, was not about his own injuries, the concussion that would plague him for months, the shrapnel in his left shoulder that still ached when the weather changed, but about Atlas. The dog was lying motionless 20 feet away, his dark fur matted with blood, his body twisted at an angle that suggested serious internal damage. "Medic!" Marcus had shouted, though his voice sounded strange, distant through the ringing in his ears. "I need a medic for my dog!" The battlefield medic, a young woman from Ohio named Jennifer Castro, had looked at Marcus as if he had lost his mind. "Sergeant, you're bleeding pretty heavily yourself. Let me take care of you first." "The dog," Marcus had insisted, trying to stand and failing as dizziness overwhelmed him. "Atlas comes first. He's my responsibility." What followed was a frantic hour of field medicine performed under fire, as Taliban fighters used the explosion as a signal to begin an ambush. While the squad took defensive positions and called for air support, Marcus crawled to Atlas and began the kind of triage he had learned to perform on human soldiers, but had never thought he would need to use on his four-legged partner. Atlas was conscious, but clearly in shock. His left hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, obviously broken, and there was blood seeping from somewhere along his rib cage. But when Marcus reached him, the dog's tail managed a weak wag, and his eyes focused on his handler's face with an expression that Marcus would later swear contained gratitude. "I've got you, boy," Marcus had whispered, his hands working to fashion a field splint from materials in his pack. "Just like you've always got me." The evacuation had been a nightmare of helicopter rotor wash, emergency surgery at the field hospital, and sleepless nights when Marcus sat beside Atlas's recovery cage, watching the rise and fall of the dog's breathing and willing him to survive. The veterinary staff had been pessimistic. Internal injuries, multiple broken bones, possible brain trauma from the concussion. "You should prepare yourself for the possibility that we might have to put him down." The veterinary surgeon had said with the kind of clinical compassion that military personnel learn to use when delivering bad news. Sometimes it's more humane than letting them suffer. Marcus's response had been immediate and non-negotiable. That dog has saved more lives than most soldiers. Whatever it takes to fix him, we do it. I'll pay for it myself if I have to. For 3 weeks, Atlas hovered between life and death. Marcus spent every off-duty hour at the veterinary clinic, talking to his unconscious partner, updating him on squad activities, reading letters from home. The other soldiers initially thought their sergeant had cracked under the stress of combat, but gradually they began to understand something important. The bond between Marcus and Atlas represented the kind of loyalty and devotion that military service was supposed to create between all of them. When Atlas finally opened his eyes and lifted his head to look for Marcus, the entire forward operating base seemed to exhale collectively. The dog's recovery was slow. Weeks of physical therapy, relearning to walk intact, and more importantly, his ability to detect explosives hadn't been affected. Their last 6 months in Afghanistan became legendary among the troops stationed there. Marcus and Atlas, both carrying visible scars from their shared trauma, seemed to develop an even deeper connection. They could communicate with glances, coordinate responses without verbal commands, and navigate dangerous situations with the kind of seamless teamwork that other handlers envied. But it was during their final mission that Marcus truly understood how much Atlas had given up for him. They were clearing a compound, suspected of housing bomb-making materials, when Atlas suddenly froze, his body going rigid in the way that indicated he had detected something significant. But instead of his usual alert behavior, sitting and pointing toward the danger, Atlas did something he had never done before. He positioned himself directly between Marcus and the suspected threat, and began backing up, physically pushing his handler away from whatever he had found. The secondary IED, hidden in a doorframe at exactly the height where it would have killed Marcus instantly, was detonated by the explosive ordnance disposal team an hour later. Atlas had detected not just the presence of explosives, but had somehow calculated the specific threat they posed to his human partner. "That dog saved your life," the EOD specialist had told Marcus afterward. "If you'd walked through that door, we'd be sending you home in pieces." Marcus had knelt beside Atlas that night, his hands buried in the familiar warmth of his partner's fur, and made a promise that would guide the rest of his life. "I'll never leave you behind, boy. Whatever happens, wherever we go together." The transition to civilian life had been difficult for both of them. Marcus struggled with the hypervigilance that made everyday sounds feel like threats, the insomnia that came from years of sleeping with one ear open for danger, and the sense of purposelessness that many veterans experienced when they were no longer needed to keep their fellow soldiers alive. Atlas faced his own challenges. The dog, who had once been responsible for the safety of an entire squad, now found himself in a world where his primary job seemed to be lying on the couch and accepting the occasional walk around the neighborhood. His intelligence and training were going unused, and Marcus could see the restlessness in his partner's behavior. That's when Dr. David Chen had suggested the nightly walks through Cedar Falls. "Exercise is good for both of you," he had said during one of Marcus's therapy sessions. "But more than that, Atlas needs to feel useful again. Let him explore, let him use his senses, let him remember what it feels like to be working." The suggestion had proved to be exactly what civilian life. Atlas could still use his training and instincts, but now he was detecting different kinds of troubles, people in distress, situations that required help rather than military intervention. Now, carrying Maria Martinez through the hospital doors, while Atlas guided Sofia to safety, Marcus realized that his promise to never leave his partner behind had evolved into something larger. They weren't just looking out for each other anymore. They were looking out for anyone who needed the kind of protection and loyalty that had been forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and tempered by the shared experience of survival. Atlas had found their new mission before Marcus had even realized they needed one. The dog's instincts, honed by years of detecting danger, had identified a different kind of threat. The danger of despair, abandonment, and hopelessness that could destroy a family just as effectively as any improvised explosive device. As Marcus adjusted Maria's weight in his arms, feeling how her fever radiated through her thin clothing, his mind made connections that went beyond the immediate crisis. The woman's labored breathing, the child's protective posture, the baby's dangerous stillness, all of it triggered memories that were both personal and professional, creating a complex emotional response that he was still learning to navigate in civilian life. Atlas, padding alongside Sofia with the patient dignity that had made him such an effective therapy companion, seemed to understand the family's dynamics in ways that transcended his training. The dog's behavior showed none of the alertness he displayed when detecting physical threats, but rather the gentle attentiveness he reserved for people who were emotionally wounded. His positioning, close enough to provide comfort, but not so close as to seem invasive, demonstrated the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught, but only developed through extensive experience with human suffering. Marcus found himself thinking about Elena, his younger sister, who had died when he was 12 and she was only 7. The parallel wasn't exact. Elena had succumbed to leukemia rather than poverty and neglect, but the helplessness he felt now echoed the frustration he had experienced as a child, watching his parents navigate a medical system that seemed designed to exhaust families financially and emotionally before providing any real help. Elena had been diagnosed during the kind of routine checkup that their parents had almost skipped because money was tight and she seemed healthy. The doctor's words, aggressive form, immediate treatment necessary, long-term prognosis uncertain, had transformed their working-class Mexican-American family from remarkably similar to the one they were entering now. Watching his father age years in the span of months as he worked double shifts to pay for treatments that insurance covered only partially. He remembered his mother's hands, worn raw from scrubbing floors at night to earn the extra money needed for medications, and the way she would sit beside Elena's bed reading stories in Spanish because their daughter said the familiar language made the pain feel smaller. Most clearly, he remembered the morning when his father had sat him down in their tiny kitchen and explained, with tears streaming down his weathered face, that they had done everything they could, but it hadn't been enough. Elena had died, not because the doctors weren't skilled enough to save her, but because the family had run out of resources to pay for the kind of intensive care that might have made the difference. The system failed her, his father had said, his voice carrying a bitterness that 12-year-old Marcus hadn't fully understood. We live in the richest country in the world, mijo, but that doesn't mean everyone gets to benefit from that wealth. That conversation had shaped Marcus's decision to join the military, though he hadn't recognized the connection at the time. The army had offered him training, education, and the chance to be part of something larger than himself. But underneath those practical motivations was a deeper need to be useful, to be the kind of person who could stand between the vulnerable and the forces that threatened them. Atlas, who had been trained to detect the chemical signatures of hidden explosives, seemed to possess a similar ability to identify emotional distress. During their deployment, Marcus had watched his partner interact with Afghan children who had been traumatized by years of warfare. And the dog's behavior with them had been remarkably similar to what Marcus was observing now. Atlas would approach slowly, offer comfort without demanding attention, and position himself in ways that provided security without creating additional anxiety. The parallel between his military service and this moment was becoming clearer to Marcus as they moved through the hospital's entrance. In Afghanistan, his job had been to neutralize threats before they could harm innocent people. Here in Cedar Falls, the threats were different, systemic rather than explosive, bureaucratic rather than military. But the principle was the same. Vulnerable people needed protection from forces beyond their control. And sometimes that protection had to come from individuals willing to take personal risks to ensure that others survive. Had recognized in Afghan children who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Atlas, responding to the child's distress, moved closer to her side and gently nuzzled her free hand, the one that wasn't supporting baby Ethan. "Your mama is sick," Marcus said honestly, because he had learned that children in crisis situations usually handled truth better than false reassurance. "But we're going to get her the help she needs. That's why we're here." Sophia nodded, accepting his words with the kind of resigned trust that suggested she had learned to depend on the kindness of strangers. Her response reminded Marcus of something Dr. Chen had told him during one of their therapy sessions. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply show up when they need help, even if you can't fix everything that's wrong. Atlas, who had been walking steadily beside them, suddenly paused and looked up at Marcus with an expression that the veteran had learned to interpret as a request for permission. The dog had identified something, not a threat, but an opportunity to provide additional comfort, and was asking for clearance to proceed. "Go ahead, boy," Marcus said quietly, and Atlas immediately moved to Sophia's other side, creating a protective formation that surrounded her with warmth and security. The child's reaction was immediate. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since they had met her, she allowed herself to lean into the support that was being offered. Marcus realized that what was happening here was more than just an emergency response to a medical crisis. Atlas had recognized something in this family that connected to their shared experience of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The dog's training had been focused on detecting physical dangers, but his instincts were responding to emotional and social threats that were just as real and potentially just as deadly. The automatic doors leading deeper into the hospital opened ahead of them, revealing the sterile brightness of the main lobby and the challenges that lay ahead. Marcus could see the reception desk, the security station, and the administrative barriers that had probably kept the Martinez family outside in the cold rather than seeking help. But he could also see Atlas's calm determination and Sophia's growing trust. and he knew that they had already taken the most important step. They had decided to help, regardless of the obstacles they might face. The transition from the bitter February night to the artificial warmth of Memorial Health Center's lobby created an immediate sensory contrast that seemed to highlight the difference between the world outside, where families could freeze to death on hospital steps, and the world inside, where help was theoretically available, but practically restricted by regulations and procedures. Marcus paused just inside the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the harsh fluorescent lighting while assessing the environment with the tactical awareness that had become second nature during his military service. The lobby was largely empty at this hour, staffed by a skeleton crew of night shift personnel, who looked up with expressions ranging from professional concern to bureaucratic wariness as they took in the sight of a man carrying an unconscious woman, while accompanied by a young child and a large dog. Atlas, responding to the change in environment, shifted into what Marcus recognized as his working mode. The dog's posture became more alert, his movement more deliberate, as he processed the new surroundings and evaluated potential threats or obstacles to their mission. But unlike his behavior in military situations, Atlas's alertness now seemed focused on protecting Sophia rather than detecting physical dangers. He positioned himself slightly ahead of the child, creating a buffer between her and the unfamiliar people who were beginning to notice their arrival. Sophia, who had been walking with remarkable composure for an 8-year-old carrying a baby through a crisis, faltered slightly as the reality of their situation became clearer. The hospital lobby, with its polished floors, official signage, and uniformed staff, represented the kind of institutional authority that she had learned to fear. Her grip on baby Ethan tightened, and Marcus could see her beginning to withdraw into the protective shell that had probably helped her survive previous encounters with systems designed to help people like her. "It's okay," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority he had used to reassure soldiers under fire. "We're going to walk up to that desk, and I'm going to explain what's happening. You just stay close to Atlas and let me handle the talking." The approach to the reception desk felt like walking point on patrol, every step deliberate, every sense alert for signs of potential resistance or hostility. Marcus could feel the weight of Maria's illness in his arms, could hear Sophia's careful breathing behind him, could sense Atlas's readiness to respond to whatever challenges they might face. But he could also feel something else, the certainty that they were doing the right thing, regardless of how difficult it might prove to be. The night receptionist, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weary expression that came from dealing with too many emergencies on too little sleep, looked up from her computer screen as they approached. Her initial reaction, a mixture of concern and procedural caution, told Marcus everything he needed to know about the challenges they were about to face. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask about your dog," she began, her voice carrying the apologetic but firm tone of someone who had to enforce rules she didn't necessarily agree with. "We have strict policies about animals in the hospital unless they're registered service animals." Marcus felt a moment of frustration. Here he was, carrying a woman who might be dying, accompanied by a terrified child and an infant who desperately needed medical attention. And the first concern was paperwork about his dog. But he also understood that the receptionist was just doing her job, following protocols that existed for legitimate reasons, even if they sometimes created barriers to getting help. "Atlas is a certified service animal," Marcus replied, which was true in all the ways that mattered, even if the paperwork was filed under military rather than civilian regulations. "He's trained for medical response and psychological support. He stays with us." Atlas, as if understanding that his credentials were being questioned, moved closer to Sophia and performed the kind of gentle, alert behavior that clearly demonstrated his training and professionalism. The dog's calm demeanor and obvious bond with the child seemed to satisfy the receptionist's concerns about his presence. "Okay," she said, turning her attention to the more pressing issue. What's the nature of the medical emergency? Marcus adjusted Maria's position in his arms, noting that her breathing seemed to be getting more labored, and her fever felt like it was continuing to climb. This woman needs immediate attention. She's been sick for several days, running a high fever, having difficulty breathing. These are her children. The baby may also need examination for exposure and dehydration. The receptionist's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, but Marcus could see the questions forming in her expression, questions about insurance, identification, and the family's ability to pay for treatment. Before she could voice those concerns, he decided to address them directly. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice remaining calm, but taking on an edge of determination. "You're wondering about insurance cards and billing information, and whether this family can afford to be here. But here's what I need you to understand. This woman is going to die if she doesn't get help right now, and these children are going to become orphans. Everything else, all the paperwork and procedures and policies, can be sorted out later." Sophia, who had been listening to this exchange with the kind of intense attention that children develop when their survival depends on understanding adult conversations, spoke up with a voice that was small but clear. "Please don't send us away. We don't have anywhere else to go." The receptionist looked down at Sophia, and Marcus could see the moment when bureaucratic procedure collided with basic human compassion. This was a woman who had probably seen hundreds of similar situations, who had been trained to follow protocols that protected the hospital from financial liability, but who was also such an effective partner in military situations. Moved to the reception desk and placed his head gently on the counter, looking up at the receptionist with what could only be described as a plea for understanding. The gesture was so perfectly timed and so clearly intentional that it broke through whatever remaining resistance the woman might have had. "Room 3 is open," she said quietly, reaching for her phone. "I'm calling Dr. Chen now." Marcus felt a surge of relief that was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the first hurdle they would need to clear. Getting into the hospital was important, but ensuring that Maria received proper treatment and that the family stayed together would require navigating additional challenges that were probably going to be more difficult than convincing one sympathetic receptionist to bend the rules. But for now, they have achieved their immediate objective. They were inside, they had access to medical care, and they were being treated as people deserving of help rather than problems to be managed. Atlas seemed to understand that they had crossed an important threshold, and his body language relaxed slightly as he settled into a protective position beside Sophia. "Thank you," Marcus said to the receptionist, meaning it more deeply than those simple words could convey. "You're probably saving lives tonight." As they moved toward the examination room, Marcus realized that what had just happened represented more than just successful crisis intervention. It was a demonstration of how individual human choices, the receptionist's decision to prioritize compassion over procedure, Atlas's intuitive understanding of when to offer comfort, Sophia's courage in speaking up for her family's needs, could create positive outcomes even within systems that were often designed to exclude rather than include. The real test, Marcus knew, would come when they encountered hospital staff who were more concerned with liability and regulations than with the immediate human needs that had brought them here. But they had made it through the first door, literally and figuratively, and that felt like a victory worth celebrating, even if it was just the beginning of a longer and more complicated journey. The interior of Memorial Health Center stretched before them like a cathedral built to worship efficiency rather than healing. Polished marble floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting that bathed everything in a cold, clinical glow, creating an atmosphere that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. The walls, painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that hospitals favored, were adorned with carefully arranged certificates, awards, and mission statements that spoke of compassion and care, but felt as distant as museum exhibits behind glass. Marcus adjusted Maria's weight in his arms, feeling how her fever seemed to burn even hotter under these unforgiving lights. Her breathing had become more labored during their brief journey from the entrance, and he could see that her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that his military medical training recognized as a sign of serious systemic distress. Every instinct he had developed as a combat medic was screaming that this woman needed immediate intervention. Yet here they stood in a lobby that felt more like a fortress, designed to keep people out, rather than a sanctuary meant to let them in. Sophia walked beside him with the careful precision of a child who had learned that sudden movements and loud voices often brought unwanted attention from authority figures. Baby Ethan had grown alarmingly quiet in her arms, his tiny body so still that Marcus found himself watching for the subtle rise and fall of the infant's chest to confirm he was still breathing. Atlas, reading the tension in the air with the same sensitivity that had made him invaluable in detecting hidden dangers overseas, positioned himself strategically between the family and the reception area, his body language alert but non-threatening. Behind the imposing reception desk sat a man whose entire demeanor radiated the kind of rigid authority that Marcus had encountered in military bureaucrats who confused following rules with accomplishing missions. Jonathan Hayes was in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair, slicked back with precision, and a jawline that seemed permanently set in disapproval. His navy blue blazer was perfectly pressed, his tie knotted with mathematical precision, and his posture suggested someone who took pride in being the person who said no when others might be inclined to show flexibility. Hayes's nameplate read, Night Administrator, and everything about his workspace reinforced his role as the guardian of institutional policy. His desk was arranged with the kind of obsessive order that suggested someone who believed that proper paperwork could solve any problem. And multiple computer monitors displayed what appeared to be insurance verification databases, billing systems, and policy manuals that governed every aspect of patient admission. The insurance verification system that Hayes managed was a marvel of modern bureaucracy, a digital fortress designed to protect the hospital's financial interests by ensuring that every patient could demonstrate their ability to pay before receiving care. Multiple screens showed real-time insurance eligibility checks, prior authorization requirements, and payment verification protocols that could process a patient's financial worthiness in minutes, but seemed incapable of processing their immediate medical needs with similar efficiency. Other staff members had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding in their typically quiet lobby. A janitor mopping floors in the far corner had slowed his work to watch, his weathered face showing the kind of concern that came from someone who understood what it meant to worry about paying for medical care. Two nurses finishing their break near the elevator bank whispered to each other while stealing glances at the family, their expressions torn between professional sympathy and awareness of the policies they were required to enforce. A security guard stationed near the entrance had moved closer, not yet intervening, but clearly prepared to do so if the situation escalated. His hand rested casually on the radio clipped to his belt, and Marcus recognized the body language of someone who had been trained to de-escalate conflicts but was also prepared to use force if necessary. Above them all, security cameras mounted in strategic locations throughout the lobby captured every moment of the unfolding drama. These electronic witnesses would later prove crucial when the story of this night began to spread beyond the hospital's walls, but for now, They served as silent observers to a confrontation between human need and institutional indifference. The contrast between the warm desperation of the family seeking help and the cold calculation of the systems designed to evaluate their worthiness for that help could not have been more stark. Here was Maria, burning with fever and struggling to breathe, while database queries determined whether her suffering was financially viable for the hospital to address. Here was Sophia, 8 years old, and carrying responsibilities that should have belonged to adults, pleading for her mother's life, while insurance algorithms calculated coverage limits and deductible requirements. Atlas, whose training had taught him to detect the chemical signatures of hidden explosives, seemed equally capable of sensing the emotional volatility of this environment. His ears were pricked forward, his eyes moving constantly between Hayes and the other staff members, reading body language and vocal tones with the same precision he had once used to identify battlefield threats. The dog's positioning suggested he understood that danger here came not from weapons or violence, but from the kind of systematic indifference that could be just as deadly to vulnerable people. The lobby's design reinforced the power imbalance between those seeking help and those controlling access to it. The reception desk was elevated slightly above the floor level, requiring visitors to look up at the staff members who would decide their fate. Seating areas were arranged to funnel people into organized waiting patterns, and signs everywhere reminded visitors of their obligations: to have proper identification, to verify insurance coverage, to understand billing procedures, without corresponding reminders of the hospital's obligations to provide emergency care, regardless of ability to pay. Marcus could feel the weight of all these systems pressing down on them as they approached Hayes's desk. This was the moment when their desperate journey from the cold streets outside would either continue toward help and healing or end in the kind of bureaucratic rejection that had probably happened countless times before in this same lobby. The stakes could not have been higher, and everyone present seemed to understand that what happened next would define not just the fate of the Martinez family, but the character of everyone involved in making that determination. Jonathan Hayes looked up from his computer screen with the expression of a man who had seen this scenario play out too many times to feel surprised by it. His eyes took in the scene before him: the unconscious woman in Marcus's arms, the exhausted child clutching an infant, the large dog whose presence already violated several hospital policies. And his face settled into the mask of professional detachment that he wore when delivering unwelcome news to desperate people. "I'm going to need to see identification and insurance cards," Hayes said, without preamble, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had learned to deliver bad news efficiently to minimize his own discomfort. "Hospital policy requires verification of coverage before we can admit any non-emergency patients." Marcus felt his jaw clench as he processed what he had just heard. Here he stood, holding a woman who was clearly in medical crisis, accompanied by children who desperately needed care. And the first words from this administrator concerned paperwork rather than treatment. His military training had taught him to maintain composure under pressure, but it had also instilled in him a deep respect for mission priorities. And right now, the mission was saving lives, not protecting bureaucratic procedures. "This woman is burning up with fever and can barely breathe," Marcus replied, his voice controlled, but edged with the kind of authority that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. "Her baby hasn't made a sound in over an hour, and this little girl has been trying to keep her family alive on the streets." If that's not an emergency, I'd like to know what you think qualifies. Hayes's expression didn't change. He had heard similar arguments before, and his response was as practiced as a prayer.
Sir, I understand your concern, but we have protocols that must be followed. Without proper insurance verification, I cannot authorize admission. The patient will need to be stabilized and then transferred to the county facility, which accepts indigent cases.
Sophia, who had been listening to this exchange with the kind of focused attention that children develop when their survival depends on understanding adult conversations, stepped forward with baby Ethan still in her arms. Her voice, when she spoke, was small but clear, carrying the kind of desperate eloquence that only comes from someone who has nothing left to lose. "Please, don't let my mama—" Someone to help her get better. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Marcus could see their impact rippling through the lobby. The janitor had stopped pretending to clean and was now openly watching the confrontation. The two nurses near the elevator had moved closer, their faces showing the kind of distress that came from watching children beg for their parents' life. Even the security guard seemed uncomfortable with his role as potential enforcer of policies that could leave a family without help. Atlas, reading the emotional temperature of the room with the sensitivity that had made him invaluable in hostile environments, moved into a protective stance beside Sophia. The dog's positioning was deliberate and unmistakable. He was placing himself between the child and any threat, whether that threat came from hostile forces or heartless bureaucracy. His calm presence seemed to amplify Sophia's plea, creating a tableau of vulnerability and protection that was difficult to ignore. But Hayes had built his career on ignoring such emotional appeals. "I'm sorry," he said, though his tone suggested no actual sorrow. "But feelings don't change hospital policy. Without insurance or upfront payment guarantees, I cannot authorize admission to this facility. There are other options available through the county system." Marcus felt something dangerous stirring in his chest, the kind of controlled fury that had helped him survive combat but could be destructive in civilian situations. His hands, still supporting Maria's weight, wanted to reach across that desk and force this man to understand that policies and procedures meant nothing when measured against human lives. But his military discipline held, even as his voice dropped to the kind of quiet intensity that his soldiers had learned to recognize as a warning. "Let me explain something to you," Marcus said, each word carefully measured. "I spent 4 tours in Afghanistan watching people die because help didn't arrive in time. I promised myself that when I came home, I would never again stand by while someone suffered because of bureaucratic bullshit. So here's what's going to happen. This woman is going to receive medical care, and these children are going to be safe. And you're going to figure out how to make that happen within your precious policies." The confrontation had drawn the attention of more staff members, creating a growing crowd of witnesses to what was becoming a defining moment for everyone involved. Some faces showed sympathy for the family's plight. Others reflected concern about the hospital's liability, and a few displayed the kind of uncomfortable awareness that comes from watching principles collide with practicalities. Among the gathering crowd, Emma Wilson, a young nurse practitioner with auburn hair, pulled back in a messy ponytail, had quietly retrieved her phone and begun recording the interaction. Her freckled face showed the kind of righteous anger that came from someone who had entered healthcare to help people, only to discover how often those good intentions were frustrated by systemic barriers. The video she was capturing would later become crucial evidence, but in the moment, she was simply documenting what felt like an injustice in progress. Hayes, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond his ability to control it through normal administrative channels, reached for his phone to call security backup. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and step back from the desk. If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have no choice but to have you removed from the premises." The threat was clear, and Marcus realized that they had reached the point where bureaucratic power was preparing to use force to protect itself from the inconvenience of human need. Around them, the crowd of staff members seemed to hold its collective breath, understanding that what happened next would reveal something fundamental about the institution they worked for and the values it actually practiced, rather than simply proclaimed. Sophia, perhaps sensing that their situation was about to get worse rather than better, pressed closer to Atlas, who responded by positioning himself more prominently between her and Hayes. The dog's message was unmistakable. Whatever happened next, this child would not face it alone. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that somehow cut through the tension in the lobby like a bell, calling everyone to attention. Dr. David Chen emerged with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades of making critical decisions under pressure, his white coat pristine, despite the late hour, his silver hair perfectly combed, and his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights as he surveyed the scene before him. At 62, Dr. Chen carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen enough medical crises to understand which battles were worth fighting and which bureaucratic obstacles were worth ignoring. His reputation at Memorial Health Center was legendary. He was the physician other doctors called when they faced impossible cases. The administrator who could cut through red tape when lives hung in the balance, and the moral compass of an institution that sometimes lost its way in the maze of modern healthcare economics. His eyes found Marcus first, and the recognition that passed between them was immediate and profound. For a moment, the crowded lobby seemed to fade away as two men connected across time and shared tragedy, remembering a promise made over the grave of a soldier who had died too young and too far from home. "Marcus Rodriguez," Dr. Chen said quietly, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection mixed with professional concern. "I heard there was some kind of disturbance down here." His gaze shifted to Maria in Marcus's arms, and his expression immediately changed from social recognition. Emergency medicine had taught him to read symptoms at a glance, and what he saw clearly alarmed him. "She's been sick for days," Marcus explained, his voice carrying relief at finally speaking to someone who seemed more interested in solving problems than creating them. "High fever, difficulty breathing, and she lost consciousness about an hour ago. The children need to be examined too, possible dehydration and exposure." Dr. Chen stepped closer, his hand moving automatically to check Maria's pulse at her wrist, while his eyes noted the flush of fever in her cheeks and the labored quality of her breathing. His examination was brief but thorough, the kind of rapid assessment that emergency physicians perform when every second might matter. "How long has she been unconscious?" Dr. Chen asked, his attention now fully focused on the medical crisis rather than the administrative obstacles that had prevented treatment. "She's been drifting in and out for the past hour," Marcus replied, "mostly unresponsive, but she stirred when we moved her." Hayes, who had been watching this interaction with growing alarm as he realized that his authority was being superseded by someone with greater institutional power, stepped forward with his clipboard clutched like a shield. "Dr. Chen, I need to inform you that this family has no insurance verification and hospital policy clearly states—" "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Chen interrupted without raising his voice or turning away from his examination of Maria. "I'm assuming responsibility for these patients under emergency medical protocols. Any administrative concerns can be addressed after we've stabilized their conditions." The words were spoken calmly, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Around the lobby, staff members who had been watching the confrontation unfold seemed to exhale collectively, as if they had been holding their breath, waiting for someone with the power to make decisions based on medical need rather than financial calculation. Hayes's face reddened with frustration and embarrassment. "Doctor, I have to protest. The hospital's liability is my concern, not yours," Dr. Chen finished, finally turning to face the administrator, with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be impressed by bureaucratic bluster. "These people need medical care, and we're going to provide it. Everything else can be sorted out later." Dr. Chen turned his attention to Sophia, kneeling down to her eye level with the gentle demeanor he reserved for frightened children. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophia," she whispered, clutching Ethan more tightly as she studied this new adult who seemed different from the others, who had been making decisions about her family's fate. "That's a beautiful name," Dr. Chen said softly. "And who's this little guy you're taking such good care of?" "My brother Ethan," Sophia replied, her voice growing slightly stronger as she sensed genuine interest rather than procedural questioning. "He's only 2 months old, and I've been trying to keep him warm." Dr. Chen's expression showed both admiration for the child's courage and concern for the responsibility she had been forced to carry. "You've done an excellent job taking care of him, Sophia. Now we're going to take care of all of you." He stood and gestured to a passing nurse, an experienced woman whose badge identified her as Supervisor Martinez. "Linda, I need room 3 prepared for emergency admission. Full workup for the mother, CBC, chest x-ray, blood cultures, and get pediatrics down here to examine both children." Supervisor Martinez nodded with the efficiency of someone who understood that when Dr. Chen gave orders during a medical emergency, questions could wait until after patients were stabilized. "Right away, doctor." Atlas, who had been maintaining his protective position beside Sophia throughout the confrontation, seemed to understand that the tenor of the situation had changed. His body language relaxed slightly, though he remained alert and ready to respond if the family faced new threats. Dr. Chen noticed the dog and addressed Marcus with raised eyebrows. "Military working dog?" "Yes, sir. Atlas served with me in Afghanistan. He's certified for medical support and psychological assistance." "Then he stays with the family," Dr. Chen said firmly, anticipating any objections from hospital staff about animal policies. "These children have been through enough trauma without being separated from sources of comfort and security." As the group began moving toward the treatment area, Hayes made one last attempt to assert his authority. "Dr. Chen, I really must insist that proper protocols—" "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Chen said, turning back with an expression that was polite but immovable, "I suggest you focus on documenting this emergency admission properly, rather than creating obstacles to patient care. And I trust that when the hospital administration reviews this situation tomorrow, they'll understand that saving lives takes precedence over insurance verification." The message was clear. Hayes could either facilitate the treatment of these patients or find himself explaining to his superiors why he had attempted to prevent a senior physician from providing emergency care to critically ill people. As they moved through the corridor toward the treatment rooms, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in their situation. They were no longer supplicants, begging for help from an indifferent system. They were patients, under the protection of a physician, who understood that medicine was about healing people, not managing financial risk. The institutional barriers that had seemed insurmountable just moments before had crumbled before the simple assertion of human decency over bureaucratic procedure. Atlas padded alongside Sophia as they navigated the hospital corridors, his presence a steady reminder that sometimes the most important protection comes not from policies or our audio procedures, but from individuals who choose to stand between the vulnerable and the forces that would turn them away. Behind them, the lobby slowly returned to its normal quiet efficiency. But Emma Wilson's phone continued recording, capturing evidence of what had happened when compassion confronted indifference and emerged victorious. The video would soon spread far beyond the walls of Memorial Health Center. But for now, it served as documentation of a simple truth, that in the end, human decency could still triumph over institutional coldness, especially when it was backed by the authority to make such decency into policy. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos, the moment Dr. Chen pushed through the double doors with Maria still cradled in Marcus's arms. The sterile white walls that had seemed so cold and unwelcoming in the lobby now provided the backdrop for a symphony of medical efficiency that transformed the space into something that felt more like a sanctuary than an institution. "Bay 3, now!" Dr. Chen commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had orchestrated countless similar rescues over his decades of practice. The medical team responded with the precision of a military unit, each person understanding their role in what was about to unfold. Nurses appeared as if summoned by telepathy, their scrubs rustling as they moved equipment into position and prepared the treatment area for emergency intervention. Marcus lowered Maria onto the examination gurney with the same careful attention he had used when handling wounded soldiers in field hospitals, his hands reluctant to release her, as if his physical support had been the only thing keeping her alive. The transition from his arms to the medical equipment felt symbolic. He was passing responsibility for her life from his individual determination to the collective expertise of people who possessed the knowledge and tools to actually save her. Dr. Chen's transformation from the calm administrator who had diffused the lobby confrontation into the focused physician directing emergency care was remarkable to witness. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began his examination, checking pupils with a pen light, listening to lung sounds with his stethoscope, palpating her abdomen for signs of internal distress. Each movement was deliberate and informed by years of experience reading the subtle signs that bodies displayed when fighting for survival. Temperature 104.2, blood pressure 90/60, pulse 120 and thready, announced Sarah Martinez, the charge nurse whose competent presence seemed to calm everyone around her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her eyes held the kind of focused concern that came from someone who had seen enough medical crises to understand which ones required immediate intervention versus which ones could wait for more thorough evaluation. "Get me 2 large-bore IVs, normal CBC, comprehensive metabolic panel, and blood cultures," Dr. Chen ordered while continuing his examination. "I want a chest X-ray as soon as we get her stabilized, and call respiratory therapy for a breathing treatment. This looks like pneumonia that's progressed to sepsis." The mention of sepsis sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. He had seen soldiers die from sepsis when infections overwhelmed their body's ability to fight back. And he knew that Maria's survival now depended on how quickly the medical team could reverse the cascade of physiological failures that were threatening to shut down her vital organs. In the adjacent examination room, a pediatric nurse named Jennifer Walsh was conducting a thorough but gentle evaluation of both Sophia and baby Ethan. Her approach with the children was markedly different from the urgent efficiency being employed with their mother. She moved slowly, spoke softly, and took time to explain each step of her examination in words that an 8-year-old could understand without becoming frightened. "I'm just going to listen to your heart, okay, sweetie?" Jennifer said to Sophia, holding up her pediatric stethoscope. "It might feel a little cold, but it won't hurt. I'm checking to make sure everything is working the way it should." Sophia nodded with the kind of solemn cooperation that children develop when they understand that adult activities might determine their family's survival. Her small hands continued to support Ethan, even though Jennifer had assured her that it was safe to put him down on the examination table. The 8-year-old's protective instincts had been honed by months of being the only thing standing between her baby brother and a world that seemed designed to separate families like theirs. Baby Ethan's examination revealed signs of mild dehydration and exposure, but nothing that couldn't be corrected with proper nutrition and warmth. Jennifer's relief was visible as she completed her assessment, knowing that while the infant was underweight and had been stressed by his family's circumstances, he showed no signs of serious illness or developmental delays. "He's going to be fine," Jennifer told Sophia with genuine warmth. "You've done an amazing job taking care of him. He's lucky to have such a good big sister." Marcus found himself pacing the hallway between the two examination rooms, his military bearing unable to completely disguise the anxiety that was coursing through his system now that the immediate crisis had been handed over to medical professionals. His role had shifted from active protector to helpless observer, and the transition was more difficult than he had anticipated. Atlas, reading his handler's emotional state with the sensitivity enough to provide comfort if Marcus needed it. The dog's calm presence served as an anchor point in an environment that felt chaotic despite its obvious organization and professionalism. Inside Maria's treatment room, the medical team worked with choreographed precision as IV fluids began flowing into her dehydrated system, and oxygen flowed through a nasal cannula to support her labored breathing. Her vital signs, displayed on monitors that beeped and flashed with electronic precision, began showing subtle signs of improvement as her body responded to the intervention. "Blood pressure is coming up," Sarah Martinez announced, her voice carrying cautious optimism. 104/68. Pulse is down to 110 and stronger. Dr. Chen nodded while reviewing the preliminary lab results that were beginning to appear on his tablet. "White count is elevated as expected. Blood cultures will take 24 to 48 hours, but I'm starting her on broad-spectrum antibiotics now. Let's get that chest X-ray and see what we're dealing with in her lungs." The improvement in Maria's condition was gradual but unmistakable to the trained eyes watching over her. The grayish pallor that had marked her skin when Marcus carried her into the hospital was slowly being replaced by healthier color as oxygenation improved. Her breathing, while still labored, became less desperate as the combination of oxygen therapy and IV fluids began to ease the stress on her cardiovascular system. Throughout the treatment area, medical staff members who weren't directly involved in Maria's care found reasons to pass by the examination rooms, stealing glances at the family whose story was already beginning to spread through the hospital's informal communication networks. Whispered conversations in break rooms and at nursing stations conveyed both admiration for Marcus's determination to help strangers and frustration with the administrative barriers that had nearly prevented this family from receiving care. The contrast between the healing happening behind these closed doors and the bureaucratic obstacles they had faced in the lobby was stark and troubling to staff members who had entered healthcare with idealistic goals of helping people. Many of them recognized that what had happened to the Martinez family was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of larger systemic problems that placed financial considerations above human needs. As the immediate medical crisis began to stabilize, Marcus felt some of the tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since he had encountered this family on the hospital steps. The monitors showing Maria's improving vital signs provided concrete evidence that they had succeeded in getting her the help she needed before it was too late. But he also understood that this was just the beginning of a longer journey that would require navigation of systems beyond the emergency room, social services, housing assistance, and the complex web of support services vulnerable families needed to achieve long-term stability. Emma Wilson sat in the small break room adjacent to the emergency department, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the video footage she had captured on her phone during the confrontation in the hospital lobby. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her freckled face as she watched the scene unfold again on her small screen, Marcus carrying the unconscious woman, Sophia's heartbreaking plea for her mother's life, Hayes's cold rejection of their desperate need for help. As a nurse practitioner who had entered healthcare with dreams of making a difference in people's lives, Emma had witnessed countless examples of how bureaucratic obstacles could interfere with patient care, but what she had recorded tonight felt different, more stark, more cruel, and more representative of everything that was wrong with a system that treated healthcare as a commodity rather than a human right. Her fingers moved across her phone's keyboard with growing determination as she crafted a caption that would frame the story in terms that social media users could understand and share. Veteran carrying dying mother and 2 children denied emergency care because they don't have insurance. This is what healthcare looks like in America tonight. Share this if you think something is wrong with this picture. The upload process took less than 30 seconds, but Emma knew that once she pressed the final post button, there would be no taking back what was about to happen. Hospital staff were generally discouraged from posting about patient situations on social media, and she could face disciplinary action for sharing footage that had been captured on hospital property during a medical emergency. But watching Sophia beg for her mother's life while Hayes cited policy had crystallized something in Emma's mind about the difference between following rules and doing what was right. Sometimes she realized the most important ethical choice was the one that put human welfare above institutional protection. The video began attracting attention within minutes of being posted. Emma watched the view counter climb, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people sharing her footage, with comments that ranged from outraged to heartbroken to furious with the healthcare system that could produce such a scene. "This is absolutely disgusting," wrote one commenter. "How can we call ourselves a civilized country when families are literally dying outside hospitals because they can't afford care?" "That little girl's voice will haunt me forever," posted another. "No child should have to beg for her mother's life." "The man carrying that woman is a hero," added a third, but the fact that he had to fight the system to get her help shows how broken everything is. The shares multiplied exponentially as the video caught the attention of larger social media accounts with substantial followings. Local news outlets, always monitoring social media for breaking stories, began reaching out to Emma for additional information and permission to broadcast her footage on television news programs. By 3 a.m., less than 2 hours after the original post, the video had been viewed more than 50,000 times and shared across multiple platforms. The hashtags Healthcare for All, Veteran Hero, and Hospital Scandal were trending locally, and the story was beginning to attract attention from regional and national media organizations. Inside Memorial Health Center, the overnight administrative staff was awakening to a public relations nightmare that was unfolding in real time across the internet. Paul Kinsey, the hospital's director of communications, had been awakened at home by phone calls from his staff and was now rushing to the hospital to coordinate damage control efforts. The hospital's social media monitoring systems, designed to track mentions of the facility and respond to patient complaints, were lighting up with notifications as the video spread across platforms faster than any single person could track. What had begun as one nurse's documentation of an injustice was becoming a viral sensation that threatened to define Memorial Health Center's reputation for years to come. Jonathan Hayes, the night administrator whose rigid adherence to policy had sparked the confrontation, found himself at the center of a storm that was quickly growing beyond his ability to manage or control. His supervisor, called in for an emergency meeting at 4 a.m., was faced with the impossible task of defending institutional policies while managing the public outrage that those policies had generated. "We followed proper protocol," Hayes insisted during the emergency meeting, his voice carrying a defensive tone that suggested he understood his position was becoming increasingly untenable. Hospital policy clearly states that insurance verification must be completed before admission, except in cases of immediate, life-threatening emergency. But the distinction between emergency and non-emergency that seemed clear in policy manuals looked very different when viewed through the lens of social media. where a dying mother and desperate children created a narrative that no amount of administrative explanation could adequately defend. The hospital's legal department was already being consulted about potential liability issues, both from the family's treatment and from the public relations disaster that was continuing to unfold online. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Hayes's attempt to protect the hospital from financial risk by denying care had created a much larger financial and reputational risk, as the story spread to audiences far beyond Cedar Falls. By dawn, the video had been picked up by a single incident, a perfect example of larger systemic problems. The story was no longer about one family's crisis, but about a healthcare system that could produce such crises and administrators who could respond to them with such callous indifference. Emma Wilson, who had simply wanted to document an injustice she witnessed, found herself at the center of a national conversation about healthcare access, veterans treatment, and the human cost of bureaucratic policies. Her phone was ringing constantly with interview requests from journalists. Her social media accounts were flooded with messages from supporters and critics, and her simple act of pressing record had unleashed forces that none of them could have anticipated. The power of public opinion, amplified by social media and traditional news coverage, was already forcing institutional change at Memorial Health Center. Emergency meetings were being called, policies were being reviewed, and staff members who had witnessed the night's events were being interviewed by administrators who suddenly understood that their institution's reputation hung in the balance. Hayes, who had spent years building his career on strict adherence to institutional policies, was learning that in the age of viral videos and social media accountability, public opinion could trump administrative authority with devastating speed and effectiveness. The system he had worked within and defended was being challenged not by medical professionals or healthcare advocates, but by ordinary people who saw injustice and refused to accept it as inevitable. The family consultation room that Dr. Chen led them to felt like a sanctuary compared to the clinical intensity of the emergency department. Soft lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence of the treatment areas. Comfortable chairs were arranged in a circle that suggested conversation rather than medical procedures, and warm earth tones on the walls created an atmosphere designed to provide comfort during difficult discussions about diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment options. Marcus sank into one of the padded chairs with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from the emotional toll of navigating crisis after crisis while trying to protect people who depended on his strength and determination. For the first time since he had encountered the Martinez family on the hospital steps, he allowed himself to acknowledge how completely the night's events had drained his reserves of energy and composure. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation with Hayes, the urgent rush to get Maria treatment, and the anxious waiting while medical professionals worked to stabilize her condition was finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that reminded him of the exhaustion he had felt after particularly intense combat missions in Afghanistan. Sophia entered the consultation room, carrying baby Ethan with the careful precision that had become second nature to her during months of being his primary caregiver. But for the first time since Marcus had met her, the 8-year-old's shoulders seemed to relax slightly, as if she was finally allowing herself to believe that the immediate crisis might be over, and that adults with the ability to help were now taking responsibility for her family's welfare. Atlas followed them into the room, and after a quick survey to ensure there were no threats present, settled onto the carpet beside Sophia's chair with a contented sigh that suggested he too understood that they had reached a place of temporary safety. The dog's positioning was strategic but relaxed, close enough to provide comfort if needed, but calm enough to signal that his protective vigilance could be reduced without endangering those under his care. Dr. Chen closed the door gently behind them and took a seat across from Marcus, his expression showing the kind of professional satisfaction that came from successfully treating patients whose conditions had initially appeared dire, but had responded well to proper medical intervention. "Mariah is going to be fine," he began, his words carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough similar cases to make such pronouncements with confidence. "The pneumonia was serious, and if you hadn't brought her in when you did, we might have been dealing with a very different outcome. But she's responding well to antibiotics and IV fluids, and her vital signs have stabilized significantly over the past few hours." The relief that washed over Marcus was so intense that it felt almost physical, like a weight being lifted from his chest that he hadn't fully realized he had been carrying. Beside him, Sophia's eyes filled with tears, not the desperate, frightened tears she had shed earlier, but tears of relief and gratitude that came from learning that her worst fears would not be realized. "Can we see her?" Sophia asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Soon," Dr. Chen promised with a gentle smile. "She's sleeping right now, which is exactly what her body needs to fight off the infection. But in a few hours, when she's had more rest and the medications have had more time to work, you'll be able to visit with her." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his military training compelling him to gather intelligence about their next steps and potential challenges. What happens now? How long will she need to stay here? And what about the children? Do they have someplace safe to go while she recovers? Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious as he considered the practical complications that extended beyond the immediate medical crisis. "Maria will need to stay hospitalized for at least 3 to 5 days while we monitor her recovery and complete the antibiotic course. The children appear to be in good health overall, though they show signs of chronic stress and mild malnutrition that we'll need to address." He paused, looking directly at Marcus with an expression that suggested he understood the complexity of the situation they were all navigating. "I have to ask, what's your relationship to this family? Are you a relative, family friend, legal guardian?" Marcus felt the weight of that question settling over him like a familiar uniform. The honest answer was that he was a stranger who had encountered people in need and had chosen to help them. But he also understood that his continued involvement might require more formal justification than simple human compassion. "I'm someone who couldn't walk away," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that came from making decisions based on principle rather than convenience. "These people needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Whatever they need going forward, whatever support, assistance, or advocacy, I'm prepared to provide that too." Dr. Chen nodded slowly, his expression suggesting both admiration for Marcus's commitment and concern about the practical challenges that lay ahead. "Social services will need to be involved, of course. There will be questions about housing, financial assistance, long-term health care coverage. The children's welfare will be assessed to ensure they have appropriate care while Maria recovers." The mention of social services sent a visible tremor through Sophia, who had learned to associate official involvement with the possibility of family separation. Atlas, sensing the child's distress, moved closer to her chair and placed his head gently on her lap in a gesture of comfort and protection. "No one is going to separate your family," Marcus said firmly, addressing Sophia's fears directly. "Whatever bureaucratic hurdles we need to navigate, whatever paperwork needs to be completed, whatever assistance programs need to be accessed, we'll figure it out together. You're not facing this alone anymore." Dr. Chen observed this interaction with the kind of professional interest that came from years of watching how families responded to medical crises and the social complications that often accompanied them. What he was witnessing was the formation of an unconventional family unit, bound together not by blood or legal documents, but by mutual need and the kind of loyalty that could develop between people who had survived crisis together. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said quietly. "The video from tonight's admission process has gone viral on social media. The hospital is dealing with significant public relations challenges, and there's likely to be media attention focused on your family's story." Marcus felt a familiar tension returning to his shoulders as he processed the implications of unwanted public attention. His military experience had taught him to be wary of situations where his actions became subject to scrutiny by people who hadn't been present during the crisis and might not understand the decisions that had seemed necessary at the time. But as he looked at Sophia, who was now dozing against Atlas's warm fur with baby Ethan secure in her arms, Marcus realized that public attention might actually work in their favor. If the story of their night at Memorial Health Center sparked conversations about health care access and the treatment of vulnerable families, perhaps some good could come from the ordeal they had all endured. "Whatever happens with the media," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same determination that had gotten them through the night's challenges, "the important thing is that this family is safe and getting the help they need. Everything else is just noise." Dr. Chen smiled with genuine warmth as he prepared to leave them to rest. "I'll check on Maria in a few hours and update you on her progress. Try to get some sleep, all of you. You've earned it." As the door closed softly behind Dr. Chen, Marcus leaned back in his chair and allowed himself to acknowledge the magnitude of what had happened over the past few hours. He had begun the evening as a veteran taking his nightly walk with his dog, and he was ending it as the guardian of a family whose survival had depended on his willingness to fight systems that were designed to exclude, rather than include, people in desperate need. Atlas maintained his vigil beside Sophia and Ethan, his steady breathing and calm presence providing an anchor point of security in a world that had been full of uncertainty and threat just hours earlier. The dog understood, in the way that animals sometimes do, that his job description had expanded beyond protecting his primary handler to encompass the safety and welfare of the small humans who had become part of their pack. The gravel driveway stretched ahead of them like a promise, winding through 40 acres of Ohio farmland that rolled gently toward the horizon under a canopy of morning sky that seemed impossibly vast after months of seeing the world through the narrow windows of shelters and the cramped confines of an aging Honda Civic. Marcus's pickup truck, borrowed from Dr. Chen for the journey from the hospital, crunched along the familiar path that he had traveled countless times during his childhood but had avoided for years after his father's death. The farmhouse appeared through a grove of ancient oak trees like something from a storybook, a two-story structure with weathered clapboard siding that had faded to a soft gray-blue, a wraparound porch that seemed to embrace the entire front of the house, and windows that caught the morning light and threw it back in golden reflections. The century-old oak trees that surrounded the property stood like gentle giants, their massive trunks and spreading branches creating natural shelters that had witnessed generations of Rodriguez family life. Sophia pressed her face to the passenger window, her eyes wide with an expression that Marcus hadn't seen since he had first encountered her. Pure wonder mixed with cautious hope. After months of cramped shelters where privacy impossible, and space was measured in the distance between cots, the sight of open fields and endless sky seemed to overwhelm her with possibilities she had forgotten existed. "Is this really where we're going to stay?" she whispered, her voice carrying the kind of reverence that children reserve for places that seem too wonderful to be real. Marcus felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite identify as he watched her reaction. "It's home," he said simply, though the word carried more weight than he had intended. This place had been his refuge during childhood, his anchor during the difficult years after Elena's death, and the dream he had carried with him through 4 tours in Afghanistan. Now it would serve the same purpose for people who needed it even more desperately than he had. Maria, who had been quiet during the hour-long drive from Cedar Falls, stirred in the back seat where she was still recovering from her ordeal at the hospital. Her color had improved dramatically over the past 3 days, but she still moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was remembering how to be healthy after being pushed to the brink of complete collapse. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice carrying gratitude mixed with overwhelming disbelief. "You don't have to do this. We can find somewhere else to go. Some kind of temporary housing assistance." "Maria?" Marcus interrupted gently, meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror. "This place has been empty for 2 years, ever since my father passed away. It needs people living in it, taking care of it, making it feel like a home again. You'd be doing me a favor." The lie was small and kind, designed to preserve Maria's dignity, while ensuring that she understood the arrangement wasn't charity, but mutual benefit. The truth was more complicated. Marcus had been avoiding the farm since his father's funeral, unable to face the memories and responsibilities that came with inheriting the property where he had grown up. But bringing this family here felt like a way to honor both his father's memory and his own need to find purpose in civilian life. Atlas, who had been unusually quiet during the drive, seemed to come alive as they approached the house. His ears perked up, and his tail began wagging with recognition. He had spent several months here during Marcus's adjustment to civilian life, and the familiar scents and sights of the farm represented safety and freedom in ways that his canine memory associated with happiness and security. The front porch steps creaked with the same familiar sound that Marcus remembered from childhood as he helped Maria from the truck, while Sophia carefully extracted baby Ethan from his car seat. The wraparound porch, with its weathered rocking chairs and hanging flower baskets that had survived the winter, seemed to embrace them as they approached the front door. Inside, the farmhouse revealed the careful restoration work that Marcus had been doing. Sporadically over the past 2 years, the hardwood floors gleamed with fresh polish. The kitchen had been updated with modern appliances while retaining its vintage charm, and the living room fireplace stood ready to provide warmth and comfort during the cold Ohio evenings that still lay ahead. But it was the nursery that brought tears to everyone's eyes. Marcus had prepared the small room adjacent to the master bedroom with the same attention to detail he had once applied to setting up secure perimeters in hostile territory. A crib that had been carefully restored and painted, soft blue walls decorated with hand-painted clouds and stars, a rocking chair positioned perfectly for late-night feedings, and shelves stocked with baby supplies that he had purchased during Maria's hospitalization. "This is for Ethan," Marcus said unnecessarily, watching as Maria's composure finally cracked completely. She sank into the rocking chair with baby Ethan in her arms and wept, not the desperate tears of despair that had marked her lowest moments, but the healing tears of someone who had been carrying impossible burdens alone and was finally able to set them down. The safety of the nursery, the care that had gone into its preparation, and the knowledge that her infant son would sleep securely for the first time in months overwhelmed her with emotions she had been suppressing for too long. Sophia explored the house with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune without examining it carefully for hidden conditions or time limits. She opened closets and cabinets, tested light switches, and ran her hands along surfaces as if confirming that everything was real and solid and wouldn't disappear if she looked away. The guest bedroom that Marcus had prepared for Maria and the children was spacious and comfortable, with windows that looked out over the vegetable garden and duck pond that lay beyond the barn. Sophia stood at those windows for long minutes, watching the ducks paddle peacefully across the water's surface and marveling at the simple fact that she could see so far without encountering fences, walls, or the boundaries that had defined her world for months. "Come on," Marcus said when everyone had had time to process their new surroundings. "Let me show you the rest of the place." The barn tour revealed Marcus's father's workshop, still equipped with the tools and equipment needed to maintain the property and pursue the kinds of projects that gave meaning to rural life. Sophia was fascinated by everything: the workbench covered with mysterious implements, the smell of sawdust and machine oil, about soil preparation and seed selection, and involving the whole family in the process of growing their own food. But it was the duck pond that captured Sophia's imagination completely. The small body of water, fed by a natural spring and surrounded by cattails and wild grass, hosted a family of mallards who seemed completely unafraid of human presence. Sophia knelt at the water's edge, mesmerized by the gentle ripples created by the duck's movement and the simple peace of watching creatures who lived without fear or want. "They stay here all year round," Marcus explained, kneeling beside her. "The spring keeps the water from freezing completely, and they've got everything they need right here. Food, shelter, safety, sometimes that's enough." Atlas, who had been exploring the property with the enthusiasm of a dog rediscovering favorite territory, bounded up to them and settled beside Sophia with a contented sigh. His presence at the pond seemed to complete the picture: a child, a dog, and a family of ducks, sharing a moment of perfect tranquility in a world that had shown them all too little kindness. As the sun began to set over the Ohio countryside, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reflected beautifully in the pond's still surface, Marcus realized that bringing this family to the farm had accomplished something he hadn't expected. It had brought the property back to life in ways that his solitary restoration efforts never could have achieved. The house needed the sounds of children's voices. The kitchen needed the warmth of family meals. And the land needed the care that came from people who understood its value as sanctuary, rather than simply property. For the first time since his father's death, the Rodriguez family farm felt like home again. The transformation began with sunrise and the sound of roosters crowing from the hen house that Marcus had restored behind the barn. Sophia, who had been accustomed to waking up in shelters, where silence was a luxury rarely afforded and privacy was non-existent, found herself stirring naturally to the gentle sounds of farm life: birds singing, Atlas stretching and yawning on the floor beside her bed, and the distant lowing of cattle from neighboring properties. Morning chores, which Marcus had been handling alone since his return to civilian life, became family activities that served multiple purposes beyond the practical necessity of maintaining the property. They provided structure to days that might otherwise feel overwhelming in their freedom, created opportunities for teaching and learning that built confidence and competence, and established the kind of routine that helped traumatized people begin to trust that tomorrow would arrive with predictable safety and purpose. Sophia's introduction to egg collecting became a daily adventure supervised closely by Atlas, who seemed to understand that his protective duties potentially hazardous activities around livestock. The German shepherd positioned himself strategically between Sophia and the henhouse door, alert for any signs that the chickens might become aggressive toward their young visitor, but calm enough to avoid creating anxiety about the task at hand. The key is to move slowly and speak softly, Marcus explained on Sophia's first morning, demonstrating the proper technique for reaching under a broody hen to extract her eggs. They're not mean, but they can get startled if you surprise them, and nobody likes being surprised. When Maria and her children first arrived at Marcus's farm, they carried months of exhaustion and hunger. Survival had been their only rhythm, sleeping in cars, rationing food, fearing displacement. Slowly, the farm reshaped them. Sophia, 8 years old, discovered purpose in small skills, collecting eggs, learning to tend animals. Her careful hands, her seriousness, gave her a sense of security beyond food. Atlas, Marcus's retired military dog, shadowed her every move, sometimes stepping closer when she hesitated, sometimes relaxing when her confidence grew. His quiet presence became a guardian's promise. Maria healed in the way hospitals could never provide. Clean air, fresh meals, and rest rebuilt her strength. She sat on the porch with baby Ethan, watching Sophia thrive, breathing air that smelled of earth instead of disinfectant. Marcus, once a solitary veteran, taught Sophia how to read the clouds, how to sharpen tools, and how to respect the land. At the dinner table, an oak piece worn by 3 generations, stories were shared, and Sophia's laughter began to ring through the house. Evenings grew sacred. Marcus read old books, Maria told childhood stories, Sophia invented tales where brave children and loyal dogs protected the weak. Atlas's sighs at her feet became the sound of safety. Slowly, Sophia stopped packing toys away, just in case. Maria planned meals days ahead. Ethan slept through the night. For the first time, they weren't surviving, they were living. One winter evening, headlights swept across the farmhouse. Tires on gravel broke their peace. Atlas stiffened, growling low. Marcus's soldier's instincts surged back. He signaled Maria to stay inside. But Sophia peered out and went pale. "It's him," she whispered. "It's my father." Diego Morales stepped from a rental car, wearing a tailored suit and the smile of a man rehearsing for applause. 4 years earlier, he had walked away, leaving Maria pregnant and Sophia with only broken promises. Now he carried gifts like bribes, a doll, a jewelry box, clothes Ethan would outgrow in months. His words dripped with practiced warmth. "Sweetheart," he told Sophia, "Daddy has a big house now. A pool, a playroom just for you." But Sophia, wiser than her years, shook her head. "I already have a room." Marcus painted stars on the wall. "I don't want princess things." Diego pressed harder. Computers, toys, promises. She stopped him with words that sliced through the room. "You're not my daddy anymore. Daddies don't leave. Marcus is my daddy because he stayed." Diego's smile cracked. Coldness replaced charm. "I've filed for custody," he said flatly. "Courts favor biological fathers." Maria often leaned toward biology. But Marcus had one weapon, proof of presence, proof of love. The fight went public when Jessica Chen, a local reporter, filmed Sophia on the porch swing with Atlas. "Marcus teaches me to care for chickens," Sophia said. "When I have nightmares, he stays until I'm not scared. He never leaves. That's what daddies do. They stay." The clip spread like wildfire. Hashtag Keep Families Together trended nationally. Strangers donated. Veterans, teachers, farmers, and neighbors rallied. Their farm became a symbol of chosen family and community justice. Inside Sarah's office, preparation turned warlike. Phone records of Diego's silence, witnesses to his absence, doctors and teachers testifying to Sophia's progress. Even Atlas, now certified as a therapy dog, would accompany Sophia to court. The Cedar Falls courthouse loomed like a fortress. Inside, Diego arrived with 3 sleek lawyers, polished briefcases gleaming. Marcus came with Sarah, carrying only conviction. Judge Margaret Thompson presided, known for fairness and disdain for theatrics. The gallery was packed with supporters, teachers, farmers, veterans, standing for Marcus as if he were already family. Diego testified first, painting himself as a reformed man with wealth, a fiancé, a spacious home. Sarah cut through the performance. "How many times did you call your children?" "None." "No visits, no support payments, not one birthday card?" Silence. His facade shattered. Maria testified next, voice trembling. "I begged him for help when I was sick. He never called back. Marcus found us outside the hospital. He carried me inside." Then Marcus spoke, steady as a soldier. "I didn't choose to be their father. They chose me, and I chose them back. Every day since, I've known who depends on me. That will not change." The turning point came in chambers with Sophia and Atlas. Judge Thompson asked softly, "What do you want?" Sophia's answer was clear. "I want to stay with Marcus. He's my real daddy, not because of blood, but because he stays. He never breaks promises." Her words ended the case more powerfully than any lawyer could. After hours of deliberation, Judge Thompson returned. The room held its breath. "The best interests of Sophia and Ethan Martinez are served by maintaining their current family unit. Full custody awarded to Maria Martinez, with Marcus Rodriguez as legal guardian, with full parental rights." Applause erupted. Relief crashed over them like a wave. Diego's face darkened as he stormed out, muttering about appeals. But no threat could erase the truth. Sophia and Ethan had been seen, heard, and protected. Sophia turned to Marcus through tears of joy. "Will we get to stay together?" "Forever," Marcus said, lifting her into his arms, while Atlas pressed against their legs like a seal of protection. 6. Adoption of Sophia and Ethan was finalized under Judge Thompson's watch. "I want Marcus to be my real daddy forever," Sophia said with certainty. Ethan, toddling, reached for Marcus and called him Dada. Paperwork became permanent. The family became unbreakable. At the farm, life bloomed. Maria cooked meals filled with herbs from her garden. Marcus taught Sophia carpentry in the barn. Atlas, now a certified therapy dog, visited hospitals and schools, comforting children who had known trauma. The farm became a sanctuary not only for them, but for others. Families fleeing hardship, veterans struggling with reintegration, mothers escaping violence. Their home turned into a network of compassion, proving that survival could lead to healing and healing to service. Community support grew into statewide programs, policy changes, and annual fundraisers. Journalists who once covered their custody battle now documented their ripple effect, how one act of compassion had multiplied into systemic change. On the first anniversary of that winter night, Marcus stood on the porch under apple blossoms, watching Sophia chase fireflies while Ethan toddled after her. Maria's laughter drifted from the kitchen. Atlas lay at Marcus's side, content. He thought of the soldier's lesson he carried. Victory isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply the creation of a safe perimeter where life can flourish. They were no longer survivors. They were a family, built not on blood, but on choice, sacrifice, and love that stayed. And this time, Ethan's development had proceeded with the kind of steady progress that characterized children who had never known want or uncertainty. His baby milestones achieved right on schedule and celebrated with the enthusiasm of parents who understood that every small victory represented the fulfillment of promises made during desperate moments when his survival had seemed far from guaranteed. His first clear word had been Dada, delivered while reaching chubby arms toward Marcus with the absolute trust that defined secure attachment between children and the adults who had proven themselves worthy of that trust through daily acts of care and protection. The toddler's obvious comfort with farm life, his delight in feeding chickens, his fearless exploration of safe outdoor spaces, his contentment during family meals around the oak table that had witnessed generations of Rodriguez family celebrations, provided daily evidence that stability and love could overcome even the most difficult early circumstances and create the kind of childhood that every child deserved, but too few actually experienced. Maria's complete recovery from the pneumonia that had nearly killed her had been followed by her enrollment in community college courses that would prepare her for a career in social work. Her decision to pursue formal education, motivated by her desire to help other families navigate the systems that had failed her own family so completely during their time of crisis. Her studies were motherhood and medical crisis, provided a perspective that enriched her academic work while preparing her to advocate effectively for vulnerable families who needed someone who understood their struggles from personal experience rather than textbook theory. Atlas, now 7 years old, was showing subtle signs of aging that reminded everyone that even the most devoted guardians were mortal beings whose time with their families was precious and limited. His muzzle had acquired gray hairs that Marcus noticed during their evening walks, and his gait had developed a slight stiffness that spoke to years of military service and the natural process of growing older. But his devotion to family protection remained unwavering, his alertness to potential threats undiminished, and his gentle interactions with the children as patient and loving as ever. The memorial garden that Marcus had installed near the century-old oak trees honored his father's memory while creating a peaceful space where the family could reflect on the values of service, sacrifice, and community support that had shaped their understanding of what it meant to take care of people who needed help. The carefully tended flowers and herbs that surrounded a simple stone marker served as a daily reminder that their current happiness had been built on foundations laid by previous generations who had understood that individual prosperity meant nothing unless it was shared with others who were struggling to achieve their own stability and security. As twilight settled over the Ohio countryside, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected beautifully in the duck pond where Sophia had first discovered the simple peace of watching creatures who lived without fear or uncertainty. Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that they had not merely survived their crisis, but had used it as a foundation for building something stronger and more meaningful than what they had lost. The family that had been created through choice and commitment rather than biological accident had proven more resilient and loving than many traditional families that took their relationships for granted rather than recognizing them as daily gifts to be treasured and protected. The sounds of evening on the farm, children's laughter mixing with the gentle lowing of cattle from neighboring properties, the soft splash of ducks settling for the night, the rustle of leaves in the oak trees that had witnessed decades of family life, created a soundtrack of peace and contentment that served as constant reminder of how far they had all traveled from that cold February night when desperation had brought them together and compassion had transformed their separate struggles into shared strength. The fourth-grade classroom at Cedar Falls Elementary School buzzed with the kind of excited attention that characterized moments when students were about to hear the world beyond their immediate experience. Sophia stood confidently at the front of the room, her presentation materials carefully arranged on the teacher's desk, while Atlas lay calmly beside her with the patient dignity that had made him beloved by children throughout the school district, who had come to associate his presence with safety, comfort, and the kind of unconditional love that helped them feel brave enough to share their own stories and struggles. Mrs. Patterson had scheduled this presentation as part of a unit on family diversity that was designed to help her students understand that families came in many different configurations and that love, rather than biology, was the essential ingredient that made family relationships meaningful and lasting. Sophia's story provided a powerful example of how circumstances beyond children's control could create new family structures that were stronger and more loving than traditional arrangements that existed simply through genetic accident or legal obligation rather than conscious choice and daily commitment. The presentation began with Sophia's matter-of-fact explanation of her family's journey from homelessness and desperation to stability and security. Her 9-year-old voice, carrying the kind of wisdom that came from having experienced both trauma and healing, while maintaining the perspective necessary to understand that their struggles had not been their fault, and their rescue had been the result of one person's decision to choose compassion over indifference when confronted with strangers who needed help. "My first daddy left us when my mama was having my baby brother," Sophia explained to her classmates, with the directness that children appreciated more than adult attempts to soften difficult truths. "We didn't have a house or enough food, and Mama got really sick. But then Marcus found us outside the hospital and helped us, and now he's our real daddy, because he chose to take care of us every single day, not just when it was easy or convenient." Her mature understanding of love versus biology and family definitions reflected conversations with Marcus and Maria that had helped her process her experiences while developing a sophisticated grasp of what made relationships meaningful and lasting. She explained that being a parent meant more than contributing DNA to a child's existence. It required daily acts of care, consistent presence during both good times and difficult periods, and the willingness to put children's needs above adult convenience or comfort. The class's questions about Atlas and his role in their rescue revealed the fascination that children felt for the idea that animals could serve as protectors and healers as well as companions, and Sophia's responses demonstrated her understanding that Atlas's contribution to their family went far beyond his training as a military working dog to encompass the emotional support and security that his presence provided during times when human reassurance alone was not sufficient to calm fears or provide comfort. "Atlas knew we needed help before we even asked for it," Sophia explained, her hand resting gently on the dog's head, while he maintained his calm alertness to the emotional tone of the conversation. "He led Marcus to us, and then he stayed close to me when I was scared about whether Mama would be okay. Dogs can tell when people need help, and Atlas is especially good at taking care of families who are having troubles." The family portrait that Sophia had drawn for the presentation occupied a place of honor on the classroom bulletin board, its childish but detailed depiction of their family clearly positioning Atlas at the center of the composition, rather than at the edges as a pet might be portrayed. In Sophia's artistic vision, Atlas was an integral family member whose presence was essential to their happiness and security. And her classmates' comments about the drawing revealed their understanding that this family had been created through choice and mutual support rather than traditional biological relationships. Mrs. Patterson's observations about the positive change in Sophia's demeanor over the past year provided professional validation for what everyone who knew the family had witnessed. That stability and unconditional love had allowed a traumatized child to develop into a confident, empathetic student who demonstrated academic excellence while maintaining the kind of emotional resilience that came from knowing that she was valued and protected by adults who had proven their commitment through consistent actions rather than empty promises. When Sophia first enrolled in our school, she was clearly a bright child, but she was also anxious and hypervigilant in ways that suggested significant trauma, Mrs. Patterson explained to parents who had gathered for the presentation. Over the past year, I've watched her transform into a natural leader who helps other students feel welcomed and supported, and her academic performance has consistently exceeded grade-level expectations in all subject areas. The presentation sparked conversations among other students who began sharing their own stories of non-traditional families, revealing the diversity of family structures represented in a single elementary school classroom, and demonstrating that Sophia's experience, while dramatic, was part of a larger pattern of children who had found security and love through arrangements that didn't conform to idealized traditional family models, but provided the essential elements that children needed to thrive. One student talked about living with grandparents after her parents' divorce. Another described his stepfather, who had become more important to him than his biological father, and a third shared her experience of being adopted from foster care by a single mother, who had chosen to create a family through legal process rather than by tapestry of family diversity that helped all the students understand that love and commitment, rather than genetic connection, were the essential ingredients that made family relationships meaningful and lasting. The universal theme that emerged from these sharing sessions was that families could be created through choice and sustained through daily acts of care and commitment, and that children who had experienced non-traditional family arrangements often developed particularly strong appreciation for the adults who had chosen to prioritize their welfare and security above convenience or social expectations. Sophia's story provided inspiration for other children who were navigating their own family challenges while demonstrating that circumstances that seemed overwhelming could be overcome through the support of people who chose to help rather than judge. As the presentation concluded with Sophia reading a poem she had written about Atlas and his role in their rescue, her classmates' applause reflected not just appreciation for her courage in sharing her story, but recognition that they had learned something important about resilience, hope, and the power of individuals to make choices that could transform lives and create the kind of world where vulnerable people could find help rather than indifference when they needed support most desperately. The evening light painted the wraparound porch in golden hues as Marcus settled into the old rocking chair that had belonged to his father, watching Maria help Sophia with her homework at the small table they had positioned near the porch swing, while Ethan played contentedly with wooden blocks that Marcus had carved during the long winter evenings when the house was warm and filled with the peaceful sounds of family life that had once seemed like an impossible dream. The scene represented everything he had hoped civilian life could become, but had been unable to achieve until the night when Atlas's instincts had led him to a family whose desperate need had given his own life meaning and purpose beyond his individual survival and adjustment. Atlas's contented sigh as he settled at their feet with the satisfied exhaustion that came from a day spent supervising children's activities and maintaining his vigil over the farm's perimeter, carried the weight of years spent protecting people who had become more important to him than his own comfort or safety. The German shepherd's graying muzzle and slightly stiff movement reminded everyone that their guardian was aging, but his eyes remained alert and his devotion unwavering, and his presence continued to provide the sense of security that had helped traumatized children learn to trust that their current happiness was not temporary or fragile, but built on foundations strong enough to withstand whatever challenges the future might bring. The quiet conversation about being able to think beyond immediate survival concerns, to consider possibilities that extended months and years into a future that felt secure and promising, rather than uncertain and threatening. Maria's plans for completing her social work degree and establishing programs to help other families navigate crisis situations. Marcus's ideas for expanding their informal assistance programs and possibly pursuing formal certification as a foster family. And Sophia's growing interest in veterinary medicine, inspired by her relationship with Atlas. All represented the kind of long-term thinking that was only possible for people who had moved beyond survival mode into genuine prosperity that included not just financial stability, but emotional security and community support. Sophia's wish that Atlas could help other children like he had helped her reflected her understanding that their rescue had been part of something larger than their individual family's story, and her mature recognition that the love and protection they had received created obligations to extend similar help to other families who were facing circumstances that seemed overwhelming but could be overcome through the support of people who chose compassion over indifference when confronted with others' desperate need. "I want to train more dogs like Atlas," Sophia announced during one of their evening conversations, her 9-year-old voice carrying the determination that characterized her approach to goals that seemed difficult but achievable through persistent effort and dedication. "There are lots of kids who are scared and need a dog to help them feel safe, while grown-ups figure out how to fix their problems." The visible peace and security that surrounded their family now was perhaps most evident in the small details that people who had never experienced instability might take for granted. The casual way that toys and books were left scattered around the house without concern that they might need to be packed quickly for sudden departure. The long-term planning that went into seasonal activities like garden preparation and holiday celebrations, and the comfortable routines that had developed around meals, bedtimes, and weekend activities that provided structure without rigidity and predictability without monotony. Marcus's realization that saving them had also saved himself had come gradually, emerging from his growing understanding that his own sense of purpose and meaning in civilian life had been restored through his commitment to protecting and providing for people who had needed someone willing to stand between them and systems that treated vulnerable families as problems to be managed, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and support. His military training had prepared him to protect people from external threats, but his civilian mission had required learning to navigate bureaucratic families as any foreign enemy. The therapeutic value of being needed by people who appreciated his protection and care had proven more effective than any formal counseling or medical treatment in helping him adjust to civilian life and find meaning beyond his military service. Sophia's obvious trust in his ability to keep her safe, Ethan's secure attachment that demonstrated through daily interactions, and Maria's partnership in creating a stable family environment had provided the kind of purpose and belonging that many veterans struggle to find in civilian careers that felt meaningless compared to military service, where their efforts had directly impacted other people's survival and welfare. The story's closing message about hope arriving when least expected was embodied in the scene that played out every evening on their porch. A family that had been created through crisis and choice, rather than biology and tradition, sustained by daily acts of love and commitment, rather than legal obligations or social expectations, and strengthened by their shared understanding that their happiness had been earned through surviving difficulties together, rather than simply inherited through genetic luck or economic privilege. As the sun set over the Ohio countryside, painting the sky in brilliant colors that reflected in the duck pond where Sophia had first discovered the simple peace of watching creatures who lived without fear or uncertainty about their place in the world. The family silhouette against the sunset represented the fulfillment of promises made during desperate moments when survival had seemed uncertain and happiness had felt impossible to achieve. Marcus's arm around Maria's shoulder, Sophia leaning against his other side while reading a book about dogs and their human companions. Ethan playing quietly with toys that he knew would still be there tomorrow, and Atlas maintaining his eternal vigil with the patient devotion that had defined his character since that first night when his instincts had recognized people who needed help, and his training had provided the skills necessary to ensure that help was effective rather than merely well-intentioned. The legacy of their story extended far beyond their individual family, to include the community programs that had been inspired by their experience. The policy changes that had resulted from public attention to their struggles, and the countless other families who had been helped by people who had been moved by their example to choose action over indifference when confronted with others. About love come not from people, but from the four-legged angels who choose to walk beside us. Atlas didn't just save a family that cold February night. He showed us what unconditional loyalty looks like. German Shepherds have this remarkable gift of seeing straight into our hearts, understanding our pain before we even speak it, and standing guard over the people they love with a devotion that puts most humans to shame. The bond between Marcus and Atlas reminds us that our dogs aren't just pets. They're family members, protectors, and healers wrapped in fur. They teach us that real love isn't complicated. It's showing up, staying close, and never giving up on the people who matter most. If you've been blessed with a German Shepherd or any loyal companion, you know this truth already. Maybe you've been wondering how to strengthen that beautiful connection you share. There's something I've discovered that might speak to your heart. A gentle approach to understanding your dog's world more deeply. When you're ready to explore that bond further, just give us a call.